Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. This is a launching of a new series called Paul, a Roman Agent, Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. And we need to have some more background on what was the role of the Herodian family, their rule, their connection to Rome. And I think a lot of us don't put two and two together when we watch, Passion of Christ. We see, Pontius Pilate, he seems to be a Roman officer, but we don't really understand why is Rome involved in a decision involving Jesus. What's their connection? Isn't Herod Antipas and isn't he the king or the ruler? We're not sure. We're not ever that clear about the history at the time. And I think we finally have to break through that wall, and we're going to see this was very well done by Helen Bond in her work, The Historical Jesus, a guide for the perplexed. So I think we're perplexed, right? So let's unperplex ourselves and listen to what she has to say. I'm just going to do a reading today, and it's about 4 or 5 pages, so it should take about 15, 20 minutes. So enjoy. And I just wanted you to remember Mark 8:15, Jesus says, he charged then the apostles, saying, take heed, beware the leaven of Herod. So Jesus was trying to alert us the Herodian family is dangerous. They're hypocrites and evil, and we're going to see what they're willing to do whatever it takes, and they're like thugs. But they also try to placate people and aggrandize themselves by lavishing gifts and so on to get what they want through money. So we'll see. This is how they work. They're power brokers of the sort, and we're going to find out about their characteristics from Helen Bond. Okay, so here we go. First of all, we're going to be looking at her book, The Historical Jesus, A Guide for the Perplexed by Helen Bond. Her book was written in 2012, and let me tell you a little bit about her. Helen Bond is a professor of Christian origins and the head of the School of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh. Her academic biography includes a PhD from Durham University on Pontius Pilate, and she taught New Testament at the University of Aberdeen before joining Edinburgh in 2000. Bond is a well-known scholar of the historical Jesus, focusing on the social and political history of first century Judea and the canonical Gospels. She's also known for her work on Mark's Gospel as an early attempt at a biography of Jesus. Here's some of the key aspects of her biography. She has a PhD from Durham. She studied at Tübingen and St. Andrews. She focuses on Christian origins, the historical Jesus, the canonical Gospels, and the social and political history of first century Judea. And we're focusing on her works that discuss political history. She's written several books: Historical Jesus, A Guide for the Perplexed, which we'll be reading today, the first biography of Jesus, Genre and Meaning in Mark's Gospel, and then finally Pontius Pilate in History and Interpretation. She's been appointed Professor of Christian Origins and head of the School of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh. She's made numerous appearances. I'm going to play a little bit of one in a second. She's elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, March 2021. She's a co-host currently of the Biblical Time Machine podcast with David Ross, discussing social and political and theological history of the Bible. There is an article on her in Wikipedia, and we're going to take a look now at a clip from The Historical Jesus, A Guide for the Perplexed, because we do need to know what period of time Jesus was born, and particularly about the story of Herod that was in the account of Matthew, and it's not in the book of Luke, and we're going to have to ask why, and she gives us some information that I think helps us. Okay, before I play her clip, the story of Herod's massacre of the innocents is found in the Gospel of Matthew, specifically in chapter 2, verses 16 to 18. This passage describes King Herod's order to kill all male children under 2 years old in Bethlehem and its vicinity after being deceived by the Magi. The event is also sometimes referred to as the slaughter of the innocents. However, it's not in the Gospel of Luke. But he does have something in its place, which is important to determine what time Jesus was born, according to Luke. Chapter 2, verses 1 to 3 is the primary source that states the census was the reason Joseph and Mary traveled to Bethlehem. Luke says a decree from Caesar Augustus ordered the world to be registered, and everyone had to be returned to their hometown to be enrolled. Joseph, being of the line of David, had to travel to Bethlehem, his ancestral city, for this registration. So she's going to show you one aspect of this that makes you have to ask a tough question. But before I do that, I just want to show you the lineages provided by both Luke and Matthew are completely contradictory, and really even a mainstream Protestant source have got questions, can't get around that. And they're very clear. Matthew gives Joseph's father as Jacob, while Luke gives Joseph's father as Heli. I mean, come on, you can't get rid of that. That's Matthew 1:16, 3:23. If you haven't seen my channel yet, I have many episodes that show you the virgin birth was added about 180 to 200 AD, because that's when the church got upset and hired Symmachus to help them, because people had been told that the prophecy in Isaiah was about a virgin, which it isn't. It's about an Alma, a young woman. It happens to be Isaiah's wife. It's his second child, and he's actually born and appears in Isaiah chapter 8. And the prophecy has nothing to do with the miracle of a virgin being born. It was that in the future, when Emmanuel reaches a certain age, the warring factions against the kingdom of the south, the kingdom of Judea or Judah, would no longer be threatened by the kingdom of Assyria or the kingdom of the 10 tribes. So this is totally obvious that somebody corrupted our scriptures for a particular reason. We've gone through it in all those videos, but I want you to see, but we need to know when was Jesus born to know whether that Herodian account is something that could be in the lifetime of Herod, because he otherwise would have been dead if you use Luke's account. Okay, so we have to say, why would Luke have it different? And I'm going to suggest to you the Herodian people are such that they will destroy the original version, which is the Matthew version, and replace it with a text and add it inside Luke, even years after Luke has finished the work. Let me read one more thing he says here. Got Question says, in fact, between David and Jesus, yes, Matthew traces the line from David to Jesus through Solomon, and that's in Matthew 1:6, and Luke traces the line through David's son Nathan 3:31. They can't be both. And then, in fact, between David and Jesus, the only names of the genealogies that are in common are Shealtiel and Zerubbabel. I mean, so they're totally divergent, they're totally made up without one knowing about the other. That's apparently what it is. Whoever made up the Luke story was way later than Matthew, and he didn't even bother to look at Matthew. It's just so preposterous. And that's the problem. But now she's going to help us kind of unravel what's going on. Who had the bias to destroy and rewrite the Luke account to be very different from the Matthew account? So this is going to add a little bit of emphasis that maybe the Matthew account is closer to reality than is the Luke account. Okay, and obviously the Luke account did not have this when it first came out. And how do we know that? Because Marcion in 140 AD created a gospel that was predicated on Luke. But guess what passages it's missing? It's missing a virgin birth. Totally. Okay, so let's now begin with her clip.
When you look at the nativity stories of Jesus in Matthew and Luke, and based on the other material that we do have, when do you think Jesus was most probably born?
I'd say around about the year 0, if we had one. I guess it's 1 BCE, 1 CE. Seems the most likely. I mean, again, we don't know. But the story in Matthew suggests that it's 6 BCE, because it's a couple of years before the death of Herod the Great, and we know that Herod died in 4 BCE. So that's roughly about 6 BCE. In Luke, though,
Jesus is born
roughly about 6 CE, because that's when the census took place. That, in Luke's story, the census is being taken under Quirinius, and everybody has to go down to Bethlehem, or their ancestral home, to be registered. So yeah, there's about 12 years between those two dates.
Okay, so I think I've set this up where you can now see there's two different versions. Matthew talks about Herod in a very negative way, which would not be politically correct. Gospel of Luke has nothing about that and is completely wrong about Jesus' birth date, and has all the genealogy wrong. Nothing matches Matthew. So this whole episode where I'm reading you her remarks about the influence of Rome as it grew gradually and then became dominant by the time of Jesus, that's important to make a decision. Which one of these two is correct? One of them is false. Now, Matthew also has a virgin birth in it, which it didn't originally have. So all you got to do is separate that out. Very little detail, by the way, just 2 lines. And then you've got a story that doesn't have any defects in it anymore, technically. So we'll say that Matthew would have more validity at that point. So that would be a good analysis. So this is like a little exercise for you as you're hearing all this history she's going to give you about the Herodian family and their rise to power on behalf of Rome will make a big difference, I think, in how you would analyze the difference in these two texts. Okay, so let's begin. All right, so we'll begin with chapter 3, the historical context. Jesus was born into a world which had recently known profound upheaval. In order to understand his story, we need to be aware of the historical, political, and religious context of his day. This chapter will provide a brief sketch of these troubled times, before considering the messianic hopes they produced in Jesus' contemporaries and the way in which some took up the fight themselves. The historical context. In certain respects, the story of Jesus begins in the early 2nd century before the Christian era. Alexander the Great had swept through the east over a century earlier, incorporating the small territory of Judea into the largest empire ever known. When Alexander died, leaving no heirs, his lands were divided amongst his warring generals, and Judea came first under Ptolemaic Egyptian and then later Seleucid Syrian control. She didn't mention that Alexander the Great was a Macedonian leader, and so sometimes they call it the Greek Empire, but it's actually Macedonian Empire. But that's led to the subsequent control by delegates, and the Syrians, the Seleucid Empire, was the last one before the Romans came in. Alexander had built his empire not only on territorial gain, but equally on the dream of a shared language, his native Greek, so Macedonia speaks Greek, and a shared culture, an eclectic mix of Greek and Eastern traditions known as Hellenism. Most Jews were reasonably happy to incorporate Hellenistic elements into all aspects of life, always assuming, of course, that such acculturation was their own choice and that the distinctive features of their religious beliefs were not compromised. In 167, before the Christian era, however, the nation was plunged into conflict. This is on page 58 now. The Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, for reasons which are not entirely clear, directed a series of measures against Judea, which culminated in the suppression of Jewish worship. The temple was desecrated, circumcision prescribed, and abstention from pork was outlawed. Opposition broke out all over the country, but the most famous resistance came from a priest named Mattathias and his 5 sons. Relying first on guerrilla tactics and later commanding a well-trained army, Mattathias' son Judas won a series of victories which earned him the title Maccabee or Hammer. Antiochus, beset by dynastic squabbles at home, was forced to rescind his decree in 164 before the Christian era. The temple was rededicated, an event commemorated each year at Hanukkah, and Jews were once again allowed to worship freely. Having achieved their initial goal, the Maccabees set their sights even higher. Just wanted to make a point that John mentioned that Jesus went to Jerusalem at the time of Hanukkah. So that is interesting because that's supporting the what the Zealots would believe. You honor that Maccabee tradition, even though the Romans now are in control. That's the era when everything was great because the Jewish people had gotten back some element of control of their country. Let's continue. Having achieved their initial goal, the Maccabees set their sights even higher, now dreaming of an independent Jewish state. Underpinning their hopes was a powerful national mythology harking back to the kingdom of Israel, as it had been in the glorious days of David and Solomon. Religion and politics were closely linked here, as they were in all aspects of first century culture. The stronger Judea was politically, the more assured was its religious freedom. And for many, the true leader of Israel was none other than God himself. Taking full advantage of the dynastic rivalries which continued to beset the Seleucids, the Maccabean brothers finally succeeded in shaking off foreign control and establishing themselves first as high priests. Notice what controls the country first, the high priest. That's why the Romans, when they come in, they're going to appoint the high priest. And then as high priest kings of the Jewish nation. Their heirs, the Hasmoneans, were to rule for almost a century. Not everyone supported the Hasmonean bid for power, and some left the fight once religious independence had been gained. As far as they were concerned, their homeland had been overshadowed by greater nations ever since the return from exile from Babylon. And as long as religious freedom was maintained, they were content to accept this state of affairs. More dramatically, the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, generally believed to have been Essenes, that's the general hypothesis, but it's not accurate. There's never not one mention of Essenes in the entire corpus of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That was a myth created by the theologians who were selected to do the history by the Catholic Council that was controlling for very decades, almost 40 years, the scrolls, just so we know. So we're seeing a new, fresh view of that, by the way. And the Israeli Institute of Ancient Archaeology has made a big change in how we should see that. And we're going to do videos on that. Anyway, regardless, more dramatically, the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls took themselves off to the wilderness at Qumran in protest of the Hasmonean usurpation of the high priesthood. Again, the recent Israeli Institute discoveries and their full report indicates the whole idea of a community there is total myth, built out of a hypothesis that was trying to explain why there were all these plates there, and these plates were what? It turned out there was a clay plate factory using the clay that was rich and useful at the Dead Sea Scrolls, so it was an industrial area, and behind that were the hidden caves of the scrolls. And why were they put there? Likely, as Golb has said, the temple had to be emptied of all of its books so it wouldn't be destroyed in the fire that was going to come when the Romans took over. So they were secreted out a hidden tunnel underneath the temple, got to the Dead Sea, and hidden in these caves. And over 1 million people died. And obviously the people who put the scrolls there all died too in the conflagration of 70 AD. But why digress? The family were, let me start from the sentence again. More dramatically, the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls took themselves off to the wilderness at Qumran in protest as the Hasmonean usurpation of the high priesthood. Okay, I dispute that's what was going on at Qumran, okay, just to say. But people were upset about the Hasmonean usurpation of the high priesthood. The family were priests, but did not belong to the Zadokite line. So only the Levites had to be from the Zadok and this holy line, which was believed to have held the high priestly office for centuries. However, the majority of people were swept along by the tide of religious and political independence and hailed the Hasmoneans as great national liberators. Page 59 now. Under them, the nation flourished. Its borders were extended into Galilee and Samaria in the north. So this spirit of taking independence and taking control away from foreign leaders, foreign governments, had already happened in Galilee where Jesus was. So but this is not what was going on when he was on earth here. But it shows you the people had already had a taste of freedom before Jesus came. And so that you could just see he's showing up in a time period where the people want to get back to where they just got under the Hasmoneans. Let's continue. Its borders were extended into Galilee and Samaria in the north and Idumea in the south. Let me just show you a little map so you understand what this is all about. She provides this map. So the yellow cross lines like this are all the region of Herod Antipas. That's one of the rulers. Territory of Herod Antipas is the lines straight across. So these Perea and Galilee. And Samaria was actually an administrative zone of Rome. They didn't bother using the Herodians there. Okay, so Judea was an official province of Rome. That's how they did it. But here they had a delegated Herodian people to rule Galilee and Perea. All right, let's read the sentence over again. Under them, the nation flourished. Its borders were extended into Galilee and Samaria in the north and Idumea in the south. Jerusalem prospered, and Hellenistic culture once again began to permeate all aspects of life. An indication of Hasmonean popularity still visible in the New Testament is the popularity of their names: Matthias, Judas, Simon, Mary, and Salome. By the 60s, before the Christian era, however, Hasmonean power had begun to wane. Ironically, perhaps for a dynasty which had emerged from Seleucid power struggles, the Hasmonean themselves were to disintegrate into dynastic wrangling and eventual civil war. Two rivals for the throne, Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II, both made advances to Rome, the emerging new superpower in the east. In 63, before the Christian era, the Roman general Pompey installed the rather docile Hyrcanus as high priest. Notice again where the Romans are focusing on, just like the Hasmoneans had done before, is the high priest office. That's where if you can control it, you can control the people because they honored that office. See? Hyrcanus as high priest reduced Judean territories considerably and demanded heavy tribute. So Pompey is now coming in heavy-handed, taking control of the high priest's office. It was clear that Rome was now in charge. The following 2 decades saw a number of Hasmonean attempts to regain the Judean throne. Order was maintained, however, by an Idumean Jew and loyal supporter of Hyrcanus named Antipater, along with his son Herod. So this is the beginning. Antipater is the father of Herod, and so that's why later it was called the Herodians, but actually started with Antipater. The young Herod favorably impressed a number of Roman generals with his energy, bravery, and intelligence, and when the powerful Eastern Empire of Parthia, remember we had this video about Paul from Parthia, he was influenced by Parthia, where he likely had been or visited because of certain things he said. We discussed from the episode just before today, installed a Hasmonean as king in 40 before the Christian era. Okay, so when the powerful Eastern Empire of Parthia installed Hasmonean as king in 40 BCE, Mark Antony and Octavian, later to become the Emperor Augustus, offered Herod the throne of Judea. Okay, that was that province area we told you. 3 years later, following a successful siege of Jerusalem, Herod claimed his crown, taking his place on Rome's eastern border as one of the series of friendly or client kings. These kingdoms acted as buffer states between the areas of direct Roman rule and outside territories. So he did get Judea initially, so it wasn't an administrative area. That's going to change in the future when he dies. Their rulers enjoyed a certain amount of autonomy, but were expected to offer loyal support and assistance to Rome when required. Herod, Roman numeral 1 means Herod the First, known as Herod the Great, or he is popularly known, enjoyed a long and in many respects successful reign, 37 to 4 before the Christian era. She had a typo. He presented himself as a major player on the world stage, a confident and generous Hellenistic monarch, quite at ease with his Roman patrons. His loyalty to Rome was rewarded by increased territories, so that in the end, his realm could rival that of Solomon's. He was a great builder, gave generously to cities around the Mediterranean, and strove to protect Jewish rights in the diaspora. Under Herod, the city of Jerusalem was rebuilt and the temple refurbished. Now we're on page 60, transforming it into one of the wonders of the ancient world. Yet, as an absolute monarch, his reign was undoubtedly oppressive, and there are hints of ongoing tension. Herod ascended to the throne in the aftermath of a brutal and prolonged civil war and began by executing large sections of the Judean nobility, particularly those who had supported the Hasmonean opponents. So Herod was not a nice guy. Okay, he was being generous and trying to bribe people basically with money by giving money to the temple so he could get the influence that he wanted there, but it didn't actually lead to the allowance of eating meat sacrificed to idols at the temple. That's one of the things he was aiming at, but that's in another text. You'll find out if we have time. We'll put it up here on the channel. Josephus also records the presence of bandits at this time. One of these, Hezekiah, that's not King Hezekiah from hundreds of years earlier, but Hezekiah, attracted many supporters on the Syrian border until he was put down by Herod. That's in Josephus' War of the Jews 1.204. And others continued their activities in Galilee several decades later. So there's a lot of activity that's basically things that Herod would have to fight for a suppression, and that happened to Galilee. So you can see Galilee is right on the target of what the Herodian people are trying to control. And that, again, is in War of the Jews by Josephus, 1.304 to 13, 314-16. Reading through Josephus' disapproving prose, it is difficult to know whether these men were simply robbers and raiders taking advantage of the lawlessness of the times, or whether they were opposed to Herodian or Roman rule on ideological grounds. At all events, Herod built a series of desert fortresses not to protect his borders, but to maintain order among his people. So what Miss Bond is saying is there is clear emphasis in Herod's way of looking at life is not to protect the country from outside invaders, but actually keep the people in and suppress them from freedom. Let's continue. Following Herod's death in 4 BCE, the country quickly descended into almost complete anarchy. Uprisings broke out throughout the land, and a number of royal aspirants tried to seize the throne, perhaps inspired by stories of the young King David at the head of a band of brigands in 1 Samuel 21-30, and this is mentioned by Josephus in War of the Jews 2.56-65. Rome responded swiftly and aggressively, sending 2 legions under the Syrian governor Varus. They swept down through Galilee, crucifying protesters and stamping out insurrection. So this, again, is when Jesus is living in Galilee, all of this is in the minds of the people, is they've been suppressed and killed and brutally killed by the Romans, and particularly serving the Herodian family. The city of Sepphoris, only an hour's walk from Jesus' hometown of Nazareth, was burnt to the ground, and its inhabitants taken into slavery. Again, the Romans were very oppressive. Further south, a bloodthirsty battle took place in the temple, in which many Jews lost their lives. The porticos surrounding the outer courts of the temple were burned, and the treasury was plundered. Order was soon resumed, but the memories of those difficult times and the sheer brutality of the Roman legions must have left their mark. As a special honor, Herod had been granted the unusual privilege of selecting his own successor. Allowed by Rome, we'll see. The will, meaning his last will and testament, however, needed to be ratified by the emperor of Rome, and Herod's sons quickly left their troubled homeland and presented themselves in Rome. Augustus, that's the emperor, Roman emperor, decided to uphold the old king's wishes, means Herod the Great wishes, and divided the realm among 3 of his sons. Archelaus was given almost half, incorporating Judea, Idumea, and Samaria, with the title ethnarch, literally a national ruler, and the promise that he would be made king if he proved himself worthy. 2 other sons, Antipas is key because he was the one who sent Jesus back to Pilate to have him executed, and Philip were to rule as tetrarchs, literally rule of a quarter. Antipas received Galilee and Perea, while Philip was allotted largely Gentile territories to the north and east of the Sea of Galilee. Within a decade, however, Archelaus had been deposed for cruelty, and Augustus decided to turn his lands into a Roman province. So that's what happened to Judea. It ended up becoming just a Roman province. But Antipas had received Galilee and Perea for his rule. So he is trying to hold on to his rule and not have the Romans take it away from him. See what's happening? But he's ruling under their direction anyway. But he has some freedom, and that's what's important. He can tax people and collect money that way. Within a decade, however, Archelaus had been deposed for cruelty, and Augustus decided to turn his land into a Roman province under the supervision of a Roman governor sent out from Rome. And so it was that Galilee at the time of Jesus was ruled by a Jewish tetrarch, Herod Antipas, while the southern province of Judea was ruled under direct Roman control. So that you can see that's what's going on. Why? You've got the crucifixion of Jesus. You've got Pilate, and he's in the part of the land called Judea, Jerusalem, and he should have been obeying the rulers of that region, but he didn't do that. He said since Jesus was from Galilee, he's going to follow the direction of Herod Antipas, who just happened to be in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. And when Pilate said, I don't see anything wrong with him, I'm going to send him back to Herod Antipas, who orders Jesus crucified. But that's suppressed or not stated clearly so you can hear it. It basically has his guys sending Jesus back with a crown of thorns and blood on his garments and so on. And this is where he's now being depicted as a would-be king, therefore a rebel from Roman government rule, and he needs to be executed. So that was the implied statement. And also we found in the 1890s a text that had been dropped out of the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. And this was the text that said that Pilate sent Jesus back to Herod Antipas for review, but later, during that meeting with Jesus, Pilate also asked on behalf of Joseph Arimathea. Joseph Arimathea is requesting the body of Jesus after the crucifixion so it can be buried, and Pilate said, I have to send that request back over to Herod Antipas. So that the scholars say when that's true, you can tell that the ruler Herod Antipas is the one who's going to make the decision on the crucifixion as well, because he's going to make the decision about the burial. And so that's how you can deduce who was the real decision maker. It wasn't the Jews. It wasn't the people clamoring for his death. Pilate wasn't going to do it because they wanted it. He needed and got the approval from Herod Antipas. That's the guy who kills Jesus. That's not the Jews killing Jesus. And that's another thing that's falsely stated in 2 Thessalonians. Okay, so that's going to end this. And hopefully this gives you an idea of what the Roman power was all about. And it was at the time of Christ, you can see the Herodians are ruling directly the area of Galilee, and they have a big influence inside of Judea, inside of the mind of Pontius Pilate, because that's who he knew he should go to for Jesus's review, Herod Antipas. And he is the one who made the actual decision to execute Jesus. And that's just a logical deduction anyway, if you didn't know anything but the administrative law of Rome at the time. All right, God bless everybody. Take care. Ciao. Bye.